Hi guys, welcome to this video on nervous control of the cardiac cycle. Let's get started. So we've looked in previous videos about the route that blood takes through the heart, and we've also talked about the route that blood takes around the body. But as blood does flow through the heart, it goes in various places at various times and it's all very nicely coordinated. How does that actually happen? How does the heart know when to contract and how long to contract for and what order to contract in and so on? How do we actually get the heart to do that in a way that makes sense, in a way that keeps the blood flowing in the right direction at the right times? Well, that's where the nervous system comes in. The nervous system has within the heart something known as the electrical impulse pathway. Basically, the nervous system is this system whereby the brain and the central nervous system sends signals to muscles to tell them when to contract. And since the heart is a muscle, it's cardiac muscle, it too has its own nervous system. It too contracts when electrical impulses arrive. And so you can see on the diagram here, we've got this weird looking yellow thing, these tentacles that appear to be just branching out all over the place. These represent the pathways by which the electrical impulse that keeps the heart beating, because it's a muscle, remember, these are the pathways by which that electrical impulse travels through the heart. It might not be too clear, so let me just add the heart onto the diagram so you can see where these various parts are. So you've seen this diagram of the heart before, and we've overlaid here the electrical impulse pathway on top of the heart so you can see how it flows. And we have four main sections to this electrical impulse pathway, known as the SA node, the AV node, the bundle of His, and the Purkinje fibres. And the electrical impulses pass from the SA node to the AV node, to the bundle of His, and then down to the Purkinje fibres. And these are located in different spots through the heart. So the SA node is there just on top of the right atrium, the AV node between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The bundle of His runs down through the septum, down the middle of the heart, before the Purkinje fibres break out and branch out and head back up the outside muscular layer of the heart. So that's the pathway, that's the direction and the route and the stopping points, if you like, that the electrical impulses take, sent from the nervous system through the heart. But let's go into a bit more depth of detail about how this actually happens and then how this causes muscular contraction of the heart to happen in a particular order. So, first of all then, and I've put the diagram up in the top right hand corner there so you can refer back to it. First of all, the first stopping point, or in fact the starting point, is the sinoatrial node, or the SA node. Sinoatrial node. And the sinoatrial node is located at the top of the right atrium near to the vena cava. So near to the place where the deoxygenated blood is returning to the heart. And the SA node is sometimes referred to as the heart's natural pacemaker. It's from the SA node that an electrical impulse is spontaneously produced. It produces its own impulse, and sends out this electrical signal from the SA node. And it's the SA node that sends this signal into the muscles of the atrium on both sides, both atria, sends this electrical signal into the atria to cause the atria to contract. So the SA node spontaneously generates an electrical signal, an electrical impulse, and causes the atria to contract. So I've said here, it triggers atrial systole. Systole basically means increasing pressure through contraction. So atrial systole, the pressure in the atria increases because those atria are now contracting, and they're contracting because the SA node has sent an electrical signal to them to cause them to contract. So the sinoatrial node, its role is to trigger atrial systole. And you can see from the diagram that as the electrical impulse passes from the SA node, it flows down to the next stopping point, which is referred to or named the AV node. And AV stands for atrioventricular, meaning between the atrium and the ventricle. Atrioventricular node. And the atrioventricular node, the AV node, is located at the top of the septum, just near the base of the two atria. So it's just below the atria, but at the top of the septum. So above the ventricles, therefore. So above the ventricles, below the atria, just in the middle of the heart, we've got the atrioventricular node. And now the atrioventricular node is really important because what this does is it causes the electrical impulse that's running through the heart to pause. Only very briefly, approximately 1/10 of a second. So that's important to know. Approximately 1/10 of a second, the AV node buffers or slows down the process or the impulse passing through the heart. So the impulse that has caused the atria to contract is now passing through the heart and arrives at the AV node. But what the AV node doesn't want to happen is it doesn't want the ventricles to contract too soon. It doesn't want the ventricles to contract too soon because the valves between the atria and the ventricles are still open. There needs to be sufficient time for the contraction of the the contraction of the atria caused by the SA node. That contraction has to be complete before the ventricles begin to contract. So the AV node slows down the impulse passing through by about 1/10 of a second, and then it conducts it on through to the ventricles. So the electrical impulse goes from the sinoatrial node. The atria contract, it passes on to the AV node. The AV node pauses the passage of that pathway for 1/10 of a second, and then it passes it on to the bundle of His. So although it's spelt His, we pronounce it His because it's a name. A bundle of His, which is located in the septum, which is that dividing line down the middle of the heart. And the role of the bundle of His now is to conduct the electrical impulse down from the central part of the heart down to the bottom or the base of the ventricles. So after this delay, the electrical impulse is passed down to the base of the ventricles until it then begins to branch out and head back up the walls of the muscular walls of the heart on both sides, outside both ventricles, through what are known as the Purkinje fibres. Again, that's a name, Purkinje. The Purkinje fibres. And that conducts this electrical impulse back up the ventricle walls. And as that electrical impulse is conducted back up the ventricle walls, then the ventricles begin to contract or continue and complete their contraction. So the ventricles contract from the bottom up because the valves that they need to open are at the top of the ventricles. So the contraction is conducted down to the bottom of the ventricles first, or the electrical impulse is conducted to the bottom of the ventricles first, then the ventricles contract from the bottom up in order to eject the blood through the valves at the top of the ventricles. There's that delay to make sure that the valves that head back into the atria are closed, so that actually it's the lunar valves that are opened and blood is ejected either through the aorta or out through the pulmonary artery. So that's how the pathway, the electrical impulse pathway, flows through the heart. So it's an electrical signal causing contraction, but it has to cause contraction at the right time, which is where the AV node comes in. It delays that signal so that the ventricles don't contract too soon. So in terms of the cardiac cycle then, how does this influence the cardiac cycle? What's actually happening now that we've got this pathway, this electrical impulse moving through the heart? What does it actually do? Let's go into a slight bit more detail on this. So the cardiac cycle can be said to have four main parts. but it flows round and round and round, hence it being a cycle. So the first part of the cardiac cycle is what we call atrial systole. Atrial systole. And atrial systole, as I've mentioned, systole simply means the increase in pressure. The increase in pressure for contraction. So in atrial systole, what happens is both the atria at the same time, so the left and the right atria, contract at the same time. So atrial systole, which is triggered by the electrical impulse that comes from the AV node, occurs at the same time. When they both contract, blood is pushed down into the ventricles through the AV valves, through the atrioventricular valves. The bicuspid and the tricuspid valves open up and blood flows down into the ventricles. Now, what needs to happen next is that those ventricles need to increase in pressure so that the AV valves close, so that when the ventricles do fully contract, the AV valves are not still open. So the second stage is what is known as isovolumetric contraction. Isovolumetric contraction, a pretty technical term. But what it means is iso means the same and volumetric means volume. So what's happening in stage 2 here of the cardiac cycle is the volume of blood within the ventricles is not increasing. What's increasing is the pressure. And the pressure is building because the electrical impulse has been passed through to the Purkinje fibres and is now conducting back up through the walls of the ventricle. That pressure is now building. The AV valve that would allow blood to go back to the atria, which we don't want, is now closed because of the pressure building. And eventually, as the pressure continues to build, the semilunar valves will open. Okay, so the valves that allowed blood to come into the ventricles will close, and the valves that allow blood to be ejected from the ventricles will eventually open once pressure reaches a certain threshold. Now, when those AV valves close, they kind of slam shut. And that is where we have the lub sound of the lub-dub that the heart makes. Now, it might sound slightly ridiculous to refer to heart sounds as lub-dub, but that is actually technically how we describe the normal pattern of heart sound. So the pattern is lub-dub, and the lub is a quiet sound and the dub is a heavier sound. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. And the lub is the sound of those atrioventricular valves, the bicuspid and tricuspid valves, slamming shut as the ventricles increase in pressure. So we have atrial systole. Atrials contract and blood is forced into the ventricles. Then the ventricles begin to contract without adding any more blood, so it's isovolumetric. They begin to contract so the pressure increases. The AV valves close with a lub sound, and eventually the semilunar valves are forced open. So the third stage is what we call a ventricular ejection. So now, as both the ventricles are contracting, and again, like the atria, the ventricles contract at the same time, right and left, contract at the same time to force blood out. So blood from the left side of the heart is ejected into the aorta, and blood from the right side of the heart is ejected into the pulmonary artery to go and head off to the lungs to pick up some oxygen. Ventricular ejection then is the point at which blood is ejected from both ventricles at the same time. And the fourth and final stage in the cycle is isovolumetric relaxation. So this is the point where the semilunar valves close, so the ventricles have ejected blood sufficiently under pressure. That blood has been ejected into the aorta under really high pressure, and that volume of blood from that contraction has gone through the aorta and is headed around to where it's going, to the body. Those semilunar valves now close, and because they're under a decent bit of pressure, they close with a louder sound. So whereas the lub of the AV valves closing was relatively quiet, the dub of the semilunar valves closing is somewhat louder. So again, lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. And that dub is the loud sound made by the slamming shut of the semilunar valves between the ventricles and the arteries. And once they're closed, filling then begins to occur passively back again into the atria. So once the ventricles have contracted, as soon as that happens, blood starts to slowly trickle back into the atria again until the atria are sufficiently full for the cycle to begin again. The electrical impulse, it's important to remember, is controlling the speed of this. And so when the heart recognizes that blood is returning more quickly, or blood is required to be ejected more quickly, it is the sinoatrial node that responds by increasing the frequency and the strength of the electrical impulse so that the contractions happen more strongly and more quickly. So the cardiac cycle is exactly the same, it just happens faster and with greater pressures. Let's look at this graphically just to try and sum this up. Okay, so let's look at this in graphical format. We're going to focus on the left side of the heart here, and we're going to begin by looking at the yellow line, which tells us what's happening with atrial pressure. So initially there's a bump, and that bump represents the atrial pressure increasing when the sinoatrial node sends the electrical impulse to the atria to contract. So the sinoatrial node sends the impulse, and then we get this bump in atrial pressure. That causes the atrioventricular valves to open and blood to flow into the ventricles, and so therefore the atrial pressure starts to decline again until blood has flowed through and those valves then close. So that the first arrow shows the point at which the atrioventricular valves, that's between the atria and the ventricles, that's when they close. And that, you'll remember, is where we get our lub sound. The AV valves close, making a lub sound in the lub-dub sound of the heart. There is a small bump in increased pressure after that, and that is to represent the closing of the AV valves with a little bit of force, sends almost a shock wave, I guess, back through the atria that just jumps the pressure just for a split second. Then the atrial pressure continues steadily to build once again as blood returns from the body or from the lungs and starts to trickle back into the atria. So you can see that very slow and steady increase again in atrial pressure. Okay, so what happens with ventricular pressure then? So the atrial pressure is being caused by the sinoatrial node sending an impulse to the muscles around the atria to contract. Then that is paused for 1/10 of a second to allow the atria to contract fully to send blood into the ventricles, and now the electrical impulse that's been paused by the AV node is passed through the bundle of His and to the Purkinje fibres, and the ventricles now begin to contract. So now we have the second phase of isovolumetric contraction where the pressure in the ventricles starts to rise. And you'll notice how much greater the ventricular pressure, shown in green on the graph, rises compared to the atrial pressure. And that's because the muscles of the ventricles are much stronger. They're sending the blood much further, particularly in the case of the left ventricle. So the pressure has to be much greater, it must build much higher than the pressure in the atria. And so that's what happens. The ventricular pressure begins to rise, as you can see, until the pressure is so great that the semilunar valves are now pushed open. The ventricles contract, the pressure rises, and the semilunar valves now open. Now at the point where the semilunar valves open, and from the left side of the heart we're thinking about, that blood then flows not back to the atria because the AV valves are closed, but through the semilunar valves into the aorta. Now the aortic pressure is also going to take a jump because that high pressure chamber, the left ventricle, has sent that blood under high pressure into the aorta. So now the aorta too is going to see a spike in its pressure, and that's shown by the red line. So you can see as the ventricles increase in pressure, until they get to a point where the semilunar valves open and the pressure continues to increase for a little while as the contraction continues through the Purkinje fibres, or caused by the electrical impulse running through the Purkinje fibres. That left ventricle squeezes so hard that it pops those semilunar valves open, and the pressure continues to rise, and the pressure is also increased in the aorta as well as the ventricles up until a point. And then once that, I guess, that parcel of blood, that volume of blood has been sent through the aorta and is heading off where it needs to go, then eventually the pressure begins to come back down. When it reaches a particular point, those semilunar valves then close again, and the pressure, once the electrical impulse has died off, the pressure then comes back down in the ventricles as well as in the aorta. So you can see the semilunar valves close. You can see a little bump similar to the atria, the atrial valves closing. You see that little bump there that is caused by a shock wave of the valves closing. That's where we've got the dub sound of the lub-dub. So the AV valves closing gives us the lub, the semilunar valves closing gives us the dub, and then the pressure in the aorta begins to come back down again, and the ventricular pressure also comes back down again quite rapidly. So that as the ventricles relax now, because the Purkinje fibres are no longer innervating the ventricular muscle, the ventricles relax, and as blood begins to flow back into the atria, the ventricles relax down to sort of almost resting state. And then we have the AV valves opening again to allow a slow increase or slow drip of blood into the ventricles up until the whole cycle starts again, where the sinoatrial node sends another impulse for the whole cycle to begin again. So I've tried there to match up what's going on with the electrical impulse system in the heart, matching that up with what's happening with blood flow through the heart and how that is affecting the pressure changes and at what time and in what order. Now that's pretty complicated stuff, so I hope that's been helpful for you. Get in touch with me if you need some more help on that in the comments below. But other than that, I hope that's been helpful. Thanks for sticking with it. Complicated video this time, but I'll see you in the next one. Take care for now.